I have a Minolta MC Celtic 135mm f2.8 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. The Celtic line of Minolta lenses were cheaper lenses that Minolta made. They used many of the same optical constructs as the more expensive MC lenses that Minolta was releasing at the time. But as you can see, if I just pull open, this is a 3.5 135mm earlier MC lens. You can see that the body design of the Celtic is a little bit simpler construction techniques, and the Celtic here actually echoes a lot of the later trends in design of something like the MD 135mm. Again, this is a 3.5 lens, which explains a lot of the size difference. But the later MD lens is actually kind of migrated towards this Celtic type of design, which does make them a little bit harder to repair. It has a much more integrated design, so it's not quite as repairable as some of the earlier MC lenses, but it's pretty easy to take apart and just get basic access and make some basic repairs. I wasn't able to figure out how to take the entire lens apart, but I'll explain how to take it apart as much as possible, get access to things like the diaphragm blades and some of the body sections. So we'll start off here and just get access to the front of the diaphragm and actually remove this entire front optical piece. You can see that because this is the 2.8 lens, 135mm, it's quite a bit bigger optically than the comparable 3.5 lenses, and it's much heavier too. So this entire front optic, you can really feel the weight of it. So we're just going to remove that front optic right now. If you look here at the side of the lens, up under this little indentation right here, where the two sections of the lens are coming together, there's a little set screw. So I'll loosen this up slightly. And now I can just grab the top section and unscrew it. So that removes the entire front optics right here. And these front optics can be further disassembled if you really want to. Looking here at the name ring, you can see that there are two little divots on this name ring, one over here, one right here, and then one on the other side. So using a spanning wrench, you can actually undo that name ring and then go in and remove some of the different elements. And then also on the back section, there are two little pockets for a pointed tip spanning wrench. You can do the same thing to actually go in through the back of the lens. And now we've exposed the front of the aperture and the diaphragm here. So now let's take a look at the back of the lens and get access to the back of the diaphragm as well. On this lens, the diaphragm and the focusing mechanism are integrated together, and I wasn't able to find a way to separate them. So that is one limit of what I'll be showing today. So looking here at the back of the lens, you have four little screws going around here on the back section of the mounting plate, connecting that mounting plate to the main lens body. I'll just undo these four. Now just lift off the mounting plate. It has all the mechanical parts of this lens pretty much. Set that aside, there's not much to take apart there. Now we've exposed the aperture control ring going around in the back section here, and then the optics on the interior here. There's nothing holding the aperture control ring in place at this point, so it's easier to just remove it at this stage. There is a tiny little ball bearing right over here under the numbers, so just be careful when taking it out that you don't lose the ball bearing. I'm sorry, the little ball bearing is actually slightly off, rotated around here about 180 degrees. So I've removed the little ball bearing there, and it also exposes the back section of the lens. So now just to expose the back of the diaphragm, get access to that as well in case you just want to clean the diaphragm, I'm going to remove the interior, the back optic here. So looking at the back optic, there are two little divots on the top section here for a spanning wrench. Alright, so there's the entire back optic, much smaller than the front optic here, obviously. And now both sides of the diaphragm are exposed. If I actually hit the correct lever here, you can see the diaphragm there. So because the diaphragm is pretty well integrated into the focusing mechanism here, just exposing both sides of the diaphragm is probably good enough and probably the best state you can get it in to clean it, or at least that's the best state I could find to actually be able to clean the diaphragm if there's oil on it. So what you want to do for that is while you're cleaning the diaphragm is just carefully use a little bit of isopropyl alcohol or some other cleaning solution to just very gently brush the blades if there's any oil or gunk on it, and be careful not to apply too much pressure to avoid distorting the blades, and you can actually clean it pretty well in the housing. One last part of the disassembly I'll do here is actually separating the back section of the lens from the focusing mechanism a little bit. So there are 4 silver screws going around on the top section where the aperture control ring used to be. So undo those 4. That will separate these 2 sections. So now we have the section here with the depth of field scale on it, just a body section so that it can be cleaned pretty well on its own. Set that aside. Now we have the entire aperture assembly and focusing mechanism all integrated here. This is the part where I was not able to find out how to actually separate this inner diaphragm assembly from the rest of the lens. You can actually go in and separate the back section here a little bit more from the front section here, which I'll now show. So let me focus in here. So I'm going to separate the inner part of the focusing mechanism from the outer part of the focusing mechanism. Normally what limits how far you can turn the focusing mechanism is this black ring on the exterior of the focusing mechanism. It has 2 little stoppers that hit up against this little post on the inner section. So on the outer section, at the 2 extremes, there are stoppers that hit up against that post. So we want to be able to stop that. To do that, we're going to actually remove what's locking the intersection in place so that it focuses up and down instead of just spinning around, and that's these 2 rails on either side here. So these rails are locked into tracks from the outer section into tracks on the intersection here, so that when you focus up and down, the intersection of the lens moves up and down instead of just spinning about. So to undo these and therefore remove the intersection, we'll undo the 6 little screws that are holding the 2 tracks in place on either side. Now removing the 2 little tracks, it's no longer locked in place. The intersection is no longer locked in place to the outer section of the focusing mechanism. So I'll kind of note that right now the focusing mechanism was focused close to infinity, so the intersection was all the way in. And I'll just grab only the intersection of the lens up here and spin it outwards. And right where it falls out of position now, I'll just make a little mark. So I'm going to mark that this was like 1.5 over here. And that will help lining things up correctly later. It's a lot easier to line up the focusing mechanism on these longer telephoto lenses than it is on some of the wide-angle lenses, but it still can be a little bit challenging, and you may have to try 2 or 3 times when putting it back together. So what we've exposed now is the inner part of the focusing mechanism, all the coils in here, and then obviously the diaphragm still on the inside, and the outer part of the focusing mechanism. As I was mentioning before, it looks like the diaphragm itself is just being locked in place by some screws going around the exterior here, but I wasn't able to find a way to actually access those screws and be able to take apart the diaphragm and separate it from the focusing mechanism. This is pretty typical on the later MD lenses that have the diaphragm integrated into the focusing mechanism as a way to make the design simpler. So that it has the basic disassembly of this lens complete. You can definitely take apart some of these components a little bit more, like the optics here. You can actually go into the optics if there's fungus on the inside of some of these elements and not just on the exterior surfaces here. But for the most part, it's pretty surprising on how simple these MD lenses are, especially when you compare them to some of the earlier MC telephoto lenses. So just a few components here. Definitely a little bit less repairable, but it's still using mostly high quality metal components, which does make it easier to work with and correct any problems that occur. It's just that a lot of the components like this focusing mechanism are integrated into other components like the diaphragm, which makes doing things like actually cleaning off the diaphragm a little bit harder than it is on the MC lenses where those components are separate. So starting back on the reassembly now, we'll start with the focusing mechanism and getting that threaded back into place. So remember before, with the lens focused over to infinity, the little indicator here that I made a little mark on the intersection of the ring, was getting lined up with 1.5 over here. So on this step, you just want to screw the 2 sections of the focusing mechanism back together. And the only real challenge is that there's a few different positions that they can get locked back together in. And on the larger telephoto lenses, it's not as bad. There's only, I think, 2 or 3 positions that you can really lock things together in. But you want to make sure that when the back section of the lens fits together, that it's going to correctly line up with the track system here. So I've got the groove for the track system lined up with where the actual tracks are going to be locked in place there. And you may, if things are not lining up at later stages, you may have to go back at this stage and try to readjust things. So now I'll actually get the tracks back in place. So I'll line up the little track over here with where the screws are. And then on each side, reinstall the track, just pressing it into place. And reattaching it with the 3 little screws on each side. Up next, we'll reinstall the ring here with the depth of field scale. You'll notice that it has the indicator of where the current focus is. And in this case, I kind of know that it's over by infinity at the moment because it's focused all the way in. So that's a good starting position. So I'll just slide this on so it's focused over at infinity right now. And then on the back of the lens, I'll spin it around until the 4 screw holes here, 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 and here are lined up properly. Now let's take a look at how the actual aperture is going to be coupled back into the back sections of the lens, like the stop-down lever and the aperture control ring. So on the aperture and the diaphragm mechanism right here, there are 3 metal posts that are important in its control. So this one post in the middle, in between the other 2, is the one that directly controls the aperture. So if I move it back and forth, directly opens and closes the diaphragm there. The other 2 limit how far you can actually open or close the diaphragm, so its minimum or its maximum opening. So here, if I move this back and forth, now I can only partially close the diaphragm here. And if I spin it around, then I can only partially open it. So these 2 outer posts are going to be controlled by the aperture control ring. And the post right here, the one that actually directly controls the diaphragm, is going to be coupled into the back section of the lens. So the aperture control ring is the next piece that we have to get installed here. And looking here at the aperture control ring, at the side with the numbers facing towards us, the aperture control ring on the back section, there are 2 little cutouts on either side. The 2 metal posts on the aperture control ring are going to slide so that into those back sections here. But for this to work, there are 2 other things that have to get lined up properly. So looking at this, at the couplings of the aperture control ring, on these posts back here, one side has a little fork section, so something can go in between here. The other side just has a solid bar. So look back at the lens here, I want to spin around these 2 posts in here that are coupling into the diaphragm so that they're kind of lined up with the slots where the aperture control ring is going to go, and that the numbers are facing towards the focusing indicator on this side. So that's how you want things to fit together. On the side with the fork over here, you want the fork to go over the little metal post, and then on the other side you want the post to go in front of the post over there so that it's kind of resting up against the post on that side, and then the fork is going over the post on this side. So that's all properly lined up, but we still have to get the little ball bearing in place as well. So if you just kind of loosely lift this up. So right over here, there's a small little indentation for the ball bearing. So just put the ball bearing in place, and then use a flat tip screw or something, a screwdriver to actually push this down as you're sliding the aperture control ring back in place. And now when it rotates back and forth, it should make that nice clicking sound as well. Also reinstall the back optic at this time, just because it'll be a little bit easier to do at this stage. So it just screws in place into the back of the lens. And the final back component is this large mounting plate piece. And this also has all the mechanical parts of the lens. So like the spring mechanism and then the actual stop-down lever coupling mechanism on the back. So this is going to hook directly into the aperture, hook this stop-down lever directly into the aperture control by this other 3rd post over here. So this 3rd post will normally be held open by the spring mechanism on this back piece, and it will be coupled in by this metal fork over here. So the fork is going to go directly on top of that metal post, and it will normally hold the aperture open. With the piece properly mounted and it all flush down in there, the 4 screw holes on the back section should now line up, and you can reattach the 2 pieces. So that has the entire back reassembly all complete. Now we just have to screw in the front piece here. So the front optic just screws in place into the front of the lens. Make sure that that's locked down tight. And then over here on the front optic, there's the little screw hole for the set screw, which fell out of place here. So I'll just get that in position and lock the front optic in place by putting the set screw in. So that is the reassembly complete. I would say that this lens is very easy to take apart and get access to a lot of the basic components, but for doing some repairs like cleaning the diaphragm, because the components are so well integrated together, it is a little bit more of a pain. All the components are still, for the most part, of higher quality metal materials. It's just that the design has been simplified so much that actually maintaining the lens is a little bit more challenging. Much closer to the later MD lenses than the MC lenses of the same era. So while this lens is very easy to take apart and it doesn't have all that many components, it is definitely not as repairable as some of the more complicated earlier MC Rokkor designs of the same era.